Okay, everybody. Hello and welcome to this joint webinar hosted by Research for Action, or RFA, Phase 2 Advisory, and the Campaign for College Opportunity. I'm Burkander, Senior Research Associate at RFA. Before we get started, I just wanted to ask everyone to take a moment to introduce yourselves in the chat. Feel free to share your name and your organization. And while you're doing that, I'm just going to do a little bit of housekeeping. Today's webinar is being recorded. We will share a link with you after a few days. In a few days after the event is complete, we welcome you to revisit the content and share it with your colleagues. We also invite your comments and questions. Please use the chat box literally. You can put questions in chat or the Q&A. We'll be monitoring both. As you put them in, we'll be reviewing them, and we'll either bring them into the conversation at the time or hold them for the Q&A after the event or after the presentation. We encourage you to share your thoughts on social media. RFA's handle is research4action on Twitter, if you are on Twitter. Today we're going to be talking about findings from 2 studies, and we'll include links to sign up for our newsletters to get notified when the reports are released. Joining me today are Melinda Karp, founder of Phase 2 Advisory, and Vikash Reddy, Vice President of Research at the Campaign for College Opportunity. Melinda is a nationally recognized expert on improving students' transitions to college and supporting them once there. She founded Phase 2 Advisory after nearly 20 years conducting research and working with colleges on education reform as the Assistant Director at the Community College Research Center, Teachers College Columbia. Vikash, who will moderate our discussion, has more than 15 years experience in higher ed research with particular expertise in outcomes-based funding policy and dev ed reform. His career began as a 3rd grade teacher at the East New York neighborhood of Brooklyn, New York. He has also served in roles at California Policy Lab at UC Berkeley and the Community College Research Center and the Center for Analysis of Post-Secondary Readiness, CAPR, at Teachers College. As I mentioned earlier, I'm a Senior Research Associate at Research for Action, and I've been working in higher ed for about 12 years, focused on the transition to college, statewide promise programs, and dev ed reform. Delighted to have this conversation with you all today. I will turn it to Vikash to get us started.
Thank you, Cree, so much for that introduction. And thank you to Research for Action for hosting this incredibly important and timely conversation. As we gather here today, the efforts to ensure racial equity in higher education are being met with fierce and sustained resistance. Anti-DEI efforts and initiatives have created a climate in which we see increased resistance to equity-based reforms at a time when some of the original motivations for these reforms have become more distant and themselves less intense. Amid this backdrop, last year, the Supreme Court of the United States undid decades worth of judicial precedent and dramatically limited the ways in which selective colleges and universities can consider students' racial and ethnic backgrounds in admissions. That court decision is going to result in fewer students from minoritized backgrounds enrolling in highly selective colleges and universities, resulting in a push for these students out to broad access and open access institutions, which already educate a disproportionate number of students from minoritized backgrounds. This elevates the need for equity advocates to address all aspects of the college experience, from preparation to admissions and from enrollment to graduation. One particularly important part of this pathway involves supporting students who are enrolling in college for the first time by accurately assessing their needs and providing them the support they need to successfully complete the gateway courses that meet both local degree requirements and transfer requirements for students at community colleges who hope to move on to a 4-year degree institution. You've heard their impressive bios, but I want to add that Cree and Melinda are 2 researchers from whom I have learned an extraordinary amount over the years, and I am certain that you will all learn quite a bit over the next half hour. I'm going to turn this over to them to share the findings of their studies and their work. But as they do so, I want to remind folks this is supposed to be a conversation and one that will benefit those of you who have taken the time to join us today. So please use the chat feature to enter any questions that you have for our researchers, and I promise you I will be monitoring those and doing my best to bring them into the conversation that follows these presentations. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Melinda Karp to talk to us about guardrails, not barriers. Melinda?
Thank you, friend. It's so nice to be here with 2 friends and folks I admire deeply, and to see so many familiar faces. Again, I'm Melinda Karp. I'm the founder of Phase 2 Advisory. I founded Phase 2 after leaving CCRC, and we work with colleges essentially to think about what evidence looks like and how you at institutions can use it. So we work directly with colleges. By the way, you're seeing my slides, not yourselves, right? Or my email? Thanks, Vikash. You never know. We work directly with institutions to support transformation efforts. We work with learning communities and higher education networks. We work with foundations, and then we do applied research, squarely targeted at this kind of work, thinking about what's happening in the field, trying to understand how change happens, as well as assessing early impacts. And so all of what we do when we write, we use the principles of sound academic research, but we write for practitioners like yourselves and for policymakers. And so what I want to do is share a little bit about this study so that we can ground our conversation, and then Cree will do the same. Our motivation for this work, and I want to express gratitude to the Ascendium group, education group for funding it, is that, as Vikash said, equity forward system change is never done. So DevEd reform, as you all know, and I'm making the assumption that you are familiar with a lot of the work that's happened in this space, was motivated with an equity imperative. And as Vikash shared, that has become even more important. We like to think of the first generation of work, the past 10 or 15 years, as sort of the first generation of DevEd work that really focused on three things: placement, curriculum, and pedagogy. And very often those three types of reforms happened separately. And we're really doubling down on the placement piece of this, but as we'll talk about, I suspect it's hard to talk about them in isolation anymore. The reality is that the evidence is clear that the work that has been done in the past 10 to 15 years has improved outcomes for students, but it's imperfect. So first of all, we know that these new approaches improve student momentum, increase access to and success in gateway courses. They start to close equity gaps, but those gaps remain. And many students are still not successful in their first foray into higher education. So the question becomes, if we're better, but not all the way there, what happens next, right? And so that's really what we're trying to unpack. We also come to this with the understanding that placement in particular, while really important, is never going to get us all the way to strong, equitable outcomes for a couple of reasons. First of all, placement reforms historically have focused on improving accuracy, like making sure the right students are in DevEd. And when they do that, they often reflect inequities that already exist in our educational system. They rely on high school grades and high school course taking. And we know that those in and of themselves are inequitable. So they start to replicate, we think, some of the inequities that already exist before students ever come into higher education. The other thing is that we know that to really, push on the promise of broad access institutions for equity, we need to touch more than just placement. We need to touch what are called those core functions of the institution: teaching, learning, advising, student support. And placement by itself does not inherently do that. You can do a placement reform and not touch anything else. And so we started to question, well, if you make your assumption that there are this is better, but it doesn't actually get us all the way there, what comes next? So we had two questions. One is about continuous improvement. We take a strong continuous improvement approach at Phase 2. So how are colleges evolving what they're doing in the placement space to get better? And secondly, is there a way to use placement, even though it's small bore, to push on this bigger issue of transformation? How do we use placement reform as a way to get to those harder nuts to crack, right? Teaching, learning, support, that in many institutions are the functions that are a little bit more resistant to change, but also are probably the most critical for student success. So we were really interested in what we call placement as transformation, which we view as the opportunity, as I said, to use the placement process to spur bigger change, intentionally addressing those gaps, generating shifts in how you structure colleges, how people work within them, what those norms are. And then we hope to create some ripple effects throughout the institution. So it's not just the placement office that's touched by the reform, but it's others as well. We did a national study. As I said, Ascendium funded it. We looked at 13 states, 15 institutions. All of them were broad access. We talked to about 50 folks. So every institution we talked to between 2 and 4 individuals, and then we did qualitative thematic data analysis. I'm happy to dig into methods for those of you who care, either later in the Q&A or offline. I want to get to the findings in the discussion, but we did a pretty detailed thematic analysis, looking again both at innovation and and evolution, as well as this notion of transformation. So for question 1, how are colleges evolving? We actually see what we're calling 3 flavors of new placement approaches. The first 2 are essentially what we think of as an evolution or an iteration of what's already being done in the field. And the third I would call a little bit more, we'll call it innovative. Some of them are truly really teasing apart what it means to place students. But to walk through them quickly, what we call reflective algorithms is essentially taking a multiple measures algorithm, which historically focuses on grades, test scores, course taking, and adds in an element of student reflection. So asking students to think about what are their academic habits, what are their experiences, do you like to read, do you like math? And bucketing those into the algorithm itself. So giving a little bit more of an insight into the student as a learner, but still spitting out a placement, right? So these are still algorithms. The college is still saying to the student, given what you've shared, we think you should be placed in this co-rec or this gateway course. 5 institutions in our sample were using that approach. The second approach is what we call guided self-placement. And of course, this has been around in small pockets of the particularly English field for a while. But guided self-placement from our perspective is innovative and iterative in that now it increasingly, again, combines a student self-assessment with some sort of a guidance. So it's not just like, let's go place ourselves. It's let's structure that conversation so the student can make an informed choice. Very often the tools for these 2 approaches are similar. The difference is that in guided self-placement, students are given information about their choices so they can select the placement that makes sense for them. And often that's used also to scaffold their understanding of what will be expected of them once they enter a class. And then finally, we have what we call just-in-time support, diagnostic just-in-time support, which is where we really kind of blow up everything we've done before. These are our most innovative, out-of-the-box approaches, and they're the most varied approaches that we saw. We have examples of this where students, in general, all students are put directly into college-level courses right away, but it's not necessarily co-rec. So it might be that students are put into their gateway course, and after the 3rd week of class, they're given the option to decide whether or not they think they need co-rec support. They might be given the opportunity to take a boot camp. They might, our most dramatic example of this is all students are placed directly in college courses, and then a college was using adult basic education funds to provide just-in-time tutoring, holistic support, study skills across the curriculum for students who needed it. So these are really different, as I said. You'll note that I said we talked to 15 colleges, and these numbers do not add up to 15. I'm a qualitative researcher, but I can do basic arithmetic. It's because we actually had a couple of studies. We had one college who, once we dug into their data, we realized they weren't really innovating or even iterating. So they weren't doing much. 2 institutions who entered our study, it turns out that when they dug into placement, they realized that placement wasn't their problem, and they pivoted to things that were broader transformation. So they're included in our broader data set, and they're an example of using placement as transformation, but their placement practices actually weren't anything different than we typically see in the field. Finally, and very quickly, so that we can turn it over to Cree, I do want to talk about this notion of, can you use placement, which feels again like a small bore reform, to transform the institution. So we coded our data along a transformation scale. And again, I'm happy to go into that later on if that's of interest to folks. Essentially looking at sort of the extent to which the full college was changing as a result of their placement reform. Transformation is not a dichotomy. It doesn't happen right away. So we have a scale, not a yes or no. The most interesting part, I think, is we saw a lot of examples of this middle one, departmental transformation, where maybe an English department was transformed, not the whole college. I'd put to you, though, that since everyone comes through English and math, if you can transform those two departments, you can make a lot of headway into improving outcomes for students. The bottom line is that of our 15 institutions, 8 of them were able to use placement as something that was bigger and more transformative. And what's really interesting is that it doesn't really matter which transformation flavor they were using, right? So we see substantial transformation with just-in-time support. We also see that just-in-time support can be very small bore. So the issue is, how are you using your placement reform, as opposed to which reform are you doing if you want to push on transformation? So I will leave it there. Consider this a teaser trailer, both for our discussion, and also we have a series of briefs that will be coming out summarizing these findings over the summer. So please reach out to myself or my colleague Suzanne Lyons, who has been my partner on this project throughout. And I'm going to turn this over to Cree. I'm going to exit and we're going to go back to the real deck. And thanks so much. I can't wait to read your questions.
As we're pulling the real deck up, I will just remind folks to shoot your questions in the chat if you have any. They can be specific to either of the studies, tie them together, things that are on your mind regarding these reforms that you think these two experts could help us come to terms with. And on that, I see some slides ready. So Cree, go ahead.
Awesome, thank you. Right, building off of this idea of institutional transformation and what's happening in the classroom, the reforms, and what can be changed in the process, I'm going to be talking about the role of faculty mindsets in implementation of placement reform. Next slide. So here's just a quick agenda. I'll talk a little bit about the motivation for the study. I'll talk a little bit about the California context, because this is all grounded in California. Do a little bit of lit review, and then spend more of the time talking about methods, analysis, and our findings. So the motivation, as we kind of alluded to earlier, the consensus is really that DevEd has failed students and that it deters students from credential completion. And we have been trying to reform it for some time now. There's also a racial equity mandate, as Black, Latinx, and Indigenous students are disproportionately or historically have been placed into DevEd. Moving those students into college-going credit-bearing pathways is a racial equity mandate. But it's not enough to just put students in these college-level courses. We have to understand their experience and make sure that they're successful, so that we can actually achieve what we're trying to achieve. So the California context, like we talked about, DevEd reform's been happening in lots of different places, in lots of different ways. California, California's been working in the space for a long time, but AB 705 and 1705 are the most recent shifts that have really led to dramatic changes in what's happening in terms of DevEd. Assembly Bill 705 was passed in 2017 and took effect in 2019. It targeted placement, requiring colleges to use high school transcript data to, quote, maximize the likelihood that students would enter and complete transfer level English and math within 1 year. And so in response, colleges expanded transfer level options. And I should pause for folks that are not in the California context. When I say transfer level, I mean basically college level, but there are 3 levels in California. So transfer level is transferable to the UC or CSU system. So I'm going to use that terminology, but just translate it to college level if that's more accessible for you. So expanding transfer level options available to students, but also creating additional supports to make sure that students could be successful, including co-recs, but there were lots of other supports that folks have been experimenting with. And then, so AB 705 was on the books for a few years. The state was feeling like they weren't seeing the changes that were really desired. And so 1705 was passed in 22 and took effect in 23, which closed perceived loopholes in AB 705 that folks felt that, that colleges were finding a way to maneuver a way around it. And so it's much more prescriptive. It basically eliminated most DevEd courses. There are exceptions, but very few. And it also has different implications for English language learning students and also the calculus pathway But for the purposes of this conversation, it really doubles down on the intention of 705. And just the other piece of context here is that the California Community College System, for those who aren't aware, is the largest and most diverse in the nation, with 106 community colleges, 114 of which are included in our study. So just again, a little bit of background. There's lots of evidence that co-requisites are effective for both English and math. But we also know that faculty mindsets matter, and that just changing structures isn't necessarily enough for students to be successful. Faculty mindset, specifically, we're talking about growth mindset here, but these are also just part of the bigger picture of shifting away, as the next bullet says, shifting away from this idea of college readiness, getting students college ready, and shifting that to talking about how colleges can become more student ready. So this study also leans on Ben Simone's work on equity mindedness to kind of help make that shift. Next slide. So this current study, we are currently rounding out year 3 of a 5-year study funded by IES to examine the implementation, impact, and cost effectiveness of reforms in response to 705 and 1705. RFA is leading the study in partnership with Lauren Schutte and her team at UT Austin. And this paper draws on the qualitative research from the implementation team, but I want to also acknowledge IES's funding that supports this work. So for our sample, we sampled 13 colleges according to a scale of implementation that we developed, trying to get a sense of what's happening across the state. With a state as big as and diverse as California, we had to start somewhere. The other piece is that because 705 wasn't very prescriptive and it gave colleges some leeway to implement the way that they saw fit, there isn't a traditional fidelity of implementation study to be done here, and so we had to devise the scale of implementation that we put together. We used 4 metrics to inform the scale. They were the proportion of introductory courses offered at transfer level, the prevalence of co-curricular supports like co-recs or embedded tutors, the college's plans for placement, and messaging to students about placement on the websites. So using those 4 metrics, we ranked institutions on a big list, and then sampled 4 at the lower end, 5 in the middle, and 4 at the top in terms of implementation. We also balanced that sample for a region, because just again, California is really diverse. We wanted to have regional representation, and rurality and size and enrollment of Black and Latinx students. We did site visits to our sample institutions in fall 22 and winter 23. So this report draws on interviews with 122 faculty and administrators. And then we add information from a faculty survey that we just did this past spring that was completed by 126 faculty across those sample institutions. So the faculty interviews were recorded and transcribed and coded in Deduce, and we coded them for equity-minded frame versus deficit-minded frame. And we were comparing responses from faculty at low and high implementing colleges to see if there was a difference. So when we're talking about cognitive deficit and equity cognitive frames, this is what we mean. So the deficit cognitive frames, this is drawing on Ben Simone, that cognitive frame, folks espousing that frame are more inclined to attribute differences in educational outcomes for Black, Latinx, and Indigenous students, such as lower rates of retention or degree completion, to cultural stereotypes, inadequate socialization, or lack of motivation and initiative on the part of the students. Versus an equity cognitive frame, folks who have that perspective are prone to notice and question patterns of educational outcome and are more likely to view inequalities in the context of a history of exclusion, discrimination, and educational apartheid. So simply put, an easier way to put it is thinking about when faculty and administrators were talking about student success and what was responsible for students being successful or not, the question was, are they attributing that success to, or the barriers to success? Is it on the student to do something different to be successful, or is it on the college to be doing something different to support those students? So that was kind of the way that we thought through how to do that coding. And so what we have here is quotes from 3 different folks. The first is an example of a deficit cognitive frame. So we hear, this is in the context when we're talking about shifting from to implementing 705 and moving faculty to teaching more transfer level courses. this faculty person says, what happened is a lot of our part-timers were the ones who were teaching remedial courses because our full-timers, they're just too talented to be wasted on teaching students who really needed to learn math, right? So just this idea that talented faculty, we can't be wasting that, having them teach, developmental students or remedial students is a waste of their time. Versus an equity-minded perspective, faculty member says, I think that part of success in these classes is impacted by our students being in poverty. It's really hard to get someone to write an essay when they are unhoused and they don't have food. Another example is when we understood that when a student is placed too low, they do poorly because they're bored. And it's also sending the message to them, you're not a college student, you don't belong here, go back and take high school math. It's all that subliminal messaging. Instead, it's like, well, you're here, come be a college student and we'll support you. So again, that shift of the onus being on the institution to really wrap their arms around the students and support them. So we saw these differences in the qualitative text, in the qualitative coding, but we wanted to see if it actually was a quantitatively significant difference. So we did a chi-square just comparing counts of codes between high and low implementer colleges and the presence of deficit or equity-minded frame. And we do see that there was a significant difference in the frequency of equity and deficit-minded comments, with folks at high implementing colleges much more likely to espouse equity-minded frames, and folks at low implementer colleges having folks much more likely to espouse deficit kind of frame, which we think is really interesting. So like I said, we administered a survey this spring to math and faculty across our sample. We had a bunch of mindset questions on the survey, and only one was statistically different between high and low implementers among English faculty, and it was the question of whether or not it would be better for some students to start in pre-transfer level courses or dev ed. So the fact that there was only one question where we saw this difference is encouraging, because it maybe means that between 22 and 24, we're seeing some shifts in faculty mindset. I don't know, it's kind of curious and interesting. So if we just go to the next slide, I think our next steps are just, what we take away from this is that changing structures and practices, putting folks into transfer level, college level coursework, putting into co-recs, putting in embedded, like those structures and supports may not be enough. That faculty may have to shift mindsets in order to support and sustain meaningful institutional transformation and make college a student-ready environment. But also with the survey results, maybe an indication that faculty mindsets might be changing, that in the 2 years since AB 705 or 1705 was passed, folks have had more time to experiment with various curricular support strategies and had more experience teaching, a different set of folks in their classrooms, and might be coming to, and there's been a lot of investments on the part of institutions in professional development around these things. And so it may be evidence that that we're starting to see some changes here, which would be really exciting. So we're about to go back into the field this fall to our site visit institutions again. And so we'll be collecting a very similar set of data, and it'll be really curious to see if we see more of this shift on the ground when we go out and talk to folks. So we'll see how that goes. And that, I think, is what I have for you.
Excellent. So thank you both. Two incredibly insightful presentations. I think different lenses on the same topic. So definitely fodder for some discussion. There are some questions coming through on the chat. I've had a couple of people direct message me their questions, which is also just fine. If you want to keep them a little more private and let me do the posing. But I am going to start with one that is visible to all, and it's a little more mechanical. It's about sort of directed or guided self-placement, and thinking about the guardrails more specifically. And so I'll start, Melinda, with you. Maybe if you could talk to us about the mechanics of some of these self-placement mechanisms and how we do ensure that students are supported and set up to make good decisions, and that they're what are the pieces there. And then Cree, I'll turn it to you after that to talk about again the faculty mindset and the shift needed for what is, I think, a fairly non-traditional and new reform. So yeah, Melinda.
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's one that we ask ourselves a lot. I should say that we, as often happens with exploratory research, have more questions than answers in many ways. our hope was to sort of set out some new visions into the world that y'all can try and we can test, but we have questions too. And guided self-placement is one of them because it feels fraught, right? Like you want to honor student agency. Our students are adult learners very often, and we know that they often don't come in with as much knowledge of higher education. And if they make a decision that doesn't work for them, that has real negative consequences, right? So what we're seeing and why we think this is such an innovation is when this is done carefully, the onus of providing information to students is placed on the institution. So the institution has to say to a student, here's what you need to know. Now you can make an informed decision. And so that really requires an institution to think about, well, what are the hallmarks of the course options, for example? So we see that happening in a couple of ways. We have one institution that actually made videos. They were really informed by a lot of the social psychology work on belonging. So sort of to echo some of what Cree was sharing, where we know that students who hear from people who look like themselves about what they can accomplish with the right resources is very powerful. So they had actually students making videos saying, this is what it takes to be successful in English 101. This is what was hard. They have instructors in the video saying, this is what I expect of you. So that's a pretty intensive approach, but I thought really interesting because they were weaving in some evidence for what they were doing. Other colleges will say to students, if you take this class, they'll put it usually in writing, like, here's what it means to take a co-rec. Here's what we will ask you to do. Here are the kinds of assignments. Students who are successful in this class usually already know how to do X, but need to learn Y. And so again, they're providing that information to students. The most, we think, most impactful way, but the hardest to scale is the version where students then actually have to meet with an advisor or a counselor. Right, to say, I took this self-assessment, here's where I think I belong, and they engage in dialogue. I will say there are some equity questions I have about that, right? Because if you don't have an equity-minded advisor or counselor, that conversation can go a little south. But that's the highest level of scaffolding. It's obviously the hardest to scale at large institutions. So different ways of doing this, but the idea is to really provide that information to students so that they're not just making a choice, they're making an informed choice. And the onus of that information is put on the college, not on the student to go hunt it down. The only other thing I'm going to add is our biggest question for both the guided self-placement and for the reflective algorithms is how students actually feel about this process. So we did not talk to students because our research questions focused on institutional practice. There is an underlying assumption in both of these approaches that if you give students information about what they need to be successful, that will scaffold their ability to meet those expectations. The more I think about it, the more I want to know if that's true. So I don't think we have any funders on this webinar, but if we do, my next research project, I hope, will be talking to students because I actually can see a version of this where it creates fear and anxiety in students, right? Asking, do you have access to a laptop? We think that that's a really supportive thing. And those of you who know me know I've been talking about this for 15 years. We think that that's supportive because we're telling students this is what you need to be successful. I am increasingly concerned that there is a subset of students for who might hear that as like, you don't have a laptop, therefore you don't belong in college. And so we don't know right now if all of this information that colleges are providing is helpful. And so I want to flag that as one of the things that in thinking about the equity implications of all of these innovations, I'm just sitting with it. It feels important to raise.
And Cree, I'll ask you just to think about what are the faculty, how do we get, and just full disclosure, I'm going to use this to segue over to student-ready institutions after you address this one.
So yeah, I mean, I think what we have seen is that faculty buy-in has been perhaps the biggest obstacle to this reform throughout the life of the reform so far. I think it's a number of reasons that contribute to that. One, I think it's an identity shift. While you do have some faculty who have been teaching the dev ed population for a really long time, there are others who have long believed that that's not who they're designed, that's not who they're there to serve. And so shifting that awareness to be like, no, we're all teaching all of these students because they're all of our students. That's a shift that I think folks across the state are making. And I think it's challenging for the folks who I formerly identified as dev ed faculty too. There's just some conflict there around like what they always believed that their mission was, and now all this research is coming out to tell them that everything they were doing was really harmful, and so that's really challenging. So I think there's lots of feelings around all of that. I think another issue has been the role of data. I think it's been, I think a lot of the messaging around the importance of this reform and the effectiveness of these reforms, it's been driven with the statewide data and a lot of averages, and a lot of institutions and faculty have struggled to see themselves and their students in those data. And I think it speaks to the need for local data analysis that can inform that conversation and help faculty see their performance of their students and how they're doing better or not as a result of these reforms. Most of them are doing better. Some folks were just instantly convinced by those data, and other folks are still maybe struggling to get their minds around it and still believe that there are students that really shouldn't, that aren't served by this. I mean, we see that in our faculty survey data too, that there still are folks, students that faculty think are not well served by these reforms, for lots of different reasons. It could be, that their skills are just really low level, or it could be that they're only coming back to school for a terminal associate's degree. And so does it really matter if they have transfer level math and English? And there's concerns about narrowing the focus of the community college and the role of the community college. If everything is geared towards transfer, are we not leaving some folks out? So there are some equity considerations from that side of things that we've heard as well. I think the last part of the complication is that, these reforms are being made in the name of equity. And while most of us can get on board with that, the fact is that the DEI agenda is something that is increasingly politicized and really difficult. And so for some folks, they just don't want anything to do with that. And we heard that from some faculty as well. So I think for lots of reasons, faculty buy-in has been a challenge. I think in terms of support, I think that there's always just more that institutions can do around professional development. We heard lots of really great promising stories around learning communities, professional learning communities. I mean, I think the most effective, a lot of what we heard in terms of the effectiveness was not necessarily the big scale conference things and case making anymore, but really the practical strategies of how do you do this at this point. I think earlier on it was very much about case making, but I think folks, generally speaking, get it, but don't know exactly necessarily how to have their students be successful in the new normal. And another piece of this was COVID, that I think there was some resistance to the frustration around the fact that this was all happening, and then with COVID there was no delay, and there was some concern about that. But that is somewhat old history now. But I think, I think in terms of faculty buy-in, that's been a persistent challenge. I think it's changing. Again, I'll be eager to see how, if at all, it's changing when we go back in the field.
Excellent. So to follow up on my warning, when I think about sort of going from a student or college-ready student mentality and shifting over to the student-ready institution mentality, there's the hearts and minds that have to be changed, right? And there's the policy that has to be changed. And so I think what I hear from Cree is that the hearts and minds it's a slower shift that maybe is getting there, but still needs work. And so the question is, what are the policy pieces, right? I yearn for a day when maybe the question is, do we need to provide you with a laptop for you to take this course, right? Or some version of that indicates that support might be available, right? So what are the sort of the policy pieces that you see, especially related to kind of placement and remediation to shifting towards student-ready institutions, and to the extent that we do still have to shift hearts and minds, what are the effective? Is there an extent towards putting the policy in place will then drag hearts and minds with us? So that's kind of what I'm wondering.
So I'm going to push back, Vikash, I'm going to do this. I'm going to push a little on the policy piece because our data are somewhat contradictory. And I say that with trepidation, knowing how many Californians are on the line who are deep in policy making them do this work. So two things. One, we do see that in general, an external force, either COVID or state policy or both together, is the impetus for placement reform in almost every college in our sample. I think it was, I want to say 13 of 15. Often the groundwork had been laid, but it was either state policy or COVID that made people like get off the fence and be like, oh, we have to change this because we can't actually do standardized testing right now in COVID. But interestingly, some of our most innovative institutions were outside of the state policy realm. And we had the hardest time finding true innovators in some of our strongest policy states. That didn't hold true across the board. We also saw innovators in strong policy states, but it wasn't a cut and dry thing. So I put that out there because I do think, particularly if you're looking at transformation, policy can only go so far, right? And Cree, you can probably speak to this too, that in many instances, policy makes people change kind of like what they do because they have to, but it doesn't change those underlying norms. Unless in our data set in any way, and this is where I think the intersection between Cree's work and ours is so exciting, what we were seeing was if folks viewed the moment as a transformational moment, then the policy becomes transformational. If folks view the policy as a thing you have to do, it becomes about compliance, and then people are just doing what they always did in a different envelope. And so I know I'm not answering your question as usual, but it's because I don't think it's as simple as what are the policy levers. Because to me, if we want to get to this transformation, and fundamentally, like I'm all in on placement reform and policy change, but what I really think needs to happen for our students is change classroom by classroom, as Cree's research shows. And I don't know that policy levers get you all the way there unless they come with a healthy dose of professional learning support, opportunities for instructors to engage in both data dive and thinking about their own norms. And so I will tell one example of this and then turn it over to Cree for her thoughts. But we have a beautiful example of a college in our study in a state that does not like to talk about DEI at all. And when they adopted a reflective algorithm, so this is this notion of we're going to ask students about their academic background, about the challenges that they might encounter, do you have access to Wi-Fi, so on and so forth. The department chair took that as an opportunity to have conversations with her faculty who, and this was a community college, but historically, their faculty had all come from like the flagship 4 years Department of Rhetoric. So they weren't really down with teaching Comp 101. She used this reflective algorithm as an opportunity to talk to her faculty about, well, why do you want me to ask about internet access? Well, why do you care about housing and food insecurity? Okay, if you think it matters, then let's talk about how you teach students who deal with these things. And actually seamlessly used the policy shift and the change in placement to weave in conversations about changing hearts and minds and pedagogy over time, right? So it wasn't the policy per se, it was that this individual used the policy to do the thing that mattered. Eventually, she then was able to like change their hiring practices and all sorts of things, but it was a process. And so again, that's why I go back and forth on the role of policy, because Vikash, you pushed me on this, like in California, if there was no policy, lots of colleges wouldn't have done anything. And we know that it's not enough, right? So that was a non-answer answer. So Cree, maybe you have something more concrete to say.
I don't know, I might just have more non-answer answer, but I think, I mean, when you first asked about policy and just the question, I think it's the long-running conversation about whether it makes more sense to be tinkering toward utopia or doing these like hard dramatic shifts that force everyone to get on board. And I think both can be effective. It depends on the scenario. I think in California, at least, part of the resistance on the part of faculty and everyone else who wasn't a fan was that it came from the top down, and that it's really easy to say like it's from these out of touch folks that don't know what's happening in my classroom, and so that makes it really easy to dismiss. It's harder to dismiss if that innovation and motivation is coming from within your department, from your colleagues, motivated by what they're seeing with their students. I think to Melinda's point about compliance, I think we definitely see that. I think that some of these lower implementers, according to our scale, we're definitely thinking about this more as compliance, and it's a box to check. We're rearranging the desk, we're rearranging the chairs, we're changing the structures, but we're not necessarily really, rethinking, innovating, transforming the way that we're thinking about students, the way that we're thinking about what we're doing in the classroom. I mean, there's pockets of that everywhere, but I wonder if that's a piece of the low implementation versus the high implementers, right? Like some of the folks that are on the higher end of that scale were folks that have been working on these reforms before the law was passed. And so, we talked to some folks that it was like, some faculty on those campuses were saying, we were so glad when the law was finally passed, because then we could say, no, don't do it for me, do it because now it's the law, right? Like they had been trying to move it forward and getting folks and getting some resistance from their peers, but it's like, now you really do have to do this because now it's the law. So, I mean, I think there's also the piece about accountability that helps too. But I agree with Melinda that I think it can't just be accountability with no support. It can't be an unfunded mandate. I mean, it was, but I think, having additional resources definitely makes a difference. And then, then you can really target the supports accordingly, whether it's professional development, whether it's, release time for folks to do those professional learning communities, whether it's reducing class sizes, someone's mentioning in the chat. I think that was something that, we heard from a lot of folks that it would be so much easier if we could just have a conversation about class size, but even having that conversation is not on the table at so many of these campuses. And so, yeah, I think, again, another non-answer, but kind of all over the place.
I'm gonna add one more thing, and I'm preaching to the choir, but I do think when we talk about policy, we keep sort of dancing around, you can talk about unfunded mandates, and I don't know how any of the folks that I know on this call are gonna crack this nut, except maybe you, Vikash. I do think we keep trying to pretend this work doesn't cost money. And I'm getting old enough and cranky enough that I'm tired of pretending that, right? Class sizes matter. It's easier to differentiate instruction with fewer students. I say that as a former classroom teacher. Many of the innovations that we were looking at require much more intensive support, right? Like if you're gonna do videos for all of your gateway courses and your co-recs and you're gonna update them every couple of years, that costs money and time. And so I don't quite yet know how to thread that needle, but I do think that we've spent many, many years talking about policy levers and ignoring the budgetary implications. And again, I say that deeply sympathetic, because the reality, you live in the envelope you live in, and right now no one's giving you more money in broad access institutions in any state that I can think of. But I do think we would be remiss to not at least acknowledge that when we talk policy, it's all fine and good to talk levers and accountability and mandates, and not at least admit that it would be a lot easier to do all those things and change hearts and minds in teaching if we had additional funding. So if there are policy people here, please listen to the good workers who are trying to do all the things without the money. But it just, I don't want to pretend anymore. And I think that that's really important at this juncture to at least acknowledge it.
Yeah, I love that, because my next question was about resources and how we, so one of the things that I think about, Melinda, when you were in your sort of first portion of your presentation, talked about the implications of this reform on other facets of college life, right? And so if you're tinkering with placement and remediation, you're tinkering with curricula, with first-year curricula, you're teaching and learning, the whole aspect. And I think sometimes there are ways in which you can just sort of feel like that's a domino effect, and the other option, I should say, for institutions is to be more intentional about that, right? And to think about how do we situate this reform, both within the larger context of teaching and learning, but also within the context of some of these other reforms. And so I'm going to ask, it's a really broad and nebulous question there, but I'll ask you both to think about sort of how do we situate the remedial and the placement reforms within this sort of larger set of pathways related reforms, and to do that within, as we've been talking about already, this sort of student-ready institution context. And since Melinda already preempted by saying she didn't know the answer to the question, I'll start with Cree and give Melinda just a little more time to think about how to come back at it.
Because clearly I have the answers. I mean, I think one thing that just comes to mind immediately is that, at least again, in the context of California, one of the things that was challenging about responding to this reform was that it was anything pertaining to revising curriculum is part of the contract. And so any extra work that folks had to do to modify their curriculum was not compensated in any kind of way. Folks got creative on institutional campuses and found ways to work around that. But I think that was definitely a constraint that a lot of institutions pointed to, was just, revising curriculum takes time, and do it, and differentiated instruction, developing a whole new approach to things like that, rethinking that takes time. And we heard from a lot of faculty that really, where there were opportunities for lots of creative ways that folks got to do this, but there were times when they were able to get together just with their departments and kind of just brainstorm and troubleshoot and think through, and that collaboration was really rich. And those folks felt much more connected to the work and felt much more buy-in, right? Because they were in it together, and they kind of worked to find ways to revise the curriculum and like bounce ideas off of each other. But you have to compensate that time, right? Like you have to find ways to support faculty to do that work, and not just, I don't know, that's a whole nother issue. But I think that's definitely a constraint that folks in California were dealing with. I think another issue that I think comes up a lot in terms of professional development is that, faculty at community colleges don't necessarily have any formal teaching training. And so trying to figure out how to address that and provide the resources that can support folks to do differentiated instruction is really challenging, even when you have formal education in training, in teaching. And so trying to figure out how to port that over and give folks strategies and approaches and ways to try things. I think those learning networks are so important. I think it's not a one-size-fits-all thing. But it is trying to cultivate like a library of resources that folks can share. I think a lot of folks within California are talking to each other across campuses, and there's lots of informal networking that happens, and that's what I think has supported this transition. But I think that could be formalized in a way. Not in a way that makes it more inaccessible, but I think, because there's something really lovely about the informality of it, but just helping it be accessible to everyone up and down the state, because I think folks in rural campuses felt much more disconnected from some of that innovation and that networking than some of the folks that are, in more densely concentrated areas. So I think, there's differences there. Those are the first two thoughts that I have, but I'm sure after Melinda talks, I might have some other thoughts.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the hard thing is we know what resources are required, and we see examples of them being leveraged, and I don't know how to get them at scale. But one of the things that we see in terms of, I think you were sort of asking almost a double-barrel question for us. One was like the resources, and one was sort of how do we situate this? So I'll start with what other resources, because we thought some really interesting examples of what else it takes to do some of these reforms outside of the classroom. So obviously advising and counseling come into play, right? So if you're going to shift how students are placed, whether that's through a more holistic algorithm or certainly through directed and guided self-placement and these just-in-time approaches, there's all sorts of implications for advising and counseling. And it dovetails nicely, actually, with holistic student support and advising redesign. So we start to see a connection there. But I will also say that most of the advisors with whom we spoke felt like this was a heavy burden to get it right, to understand the system. Increasingly, they would hear much more about students' basic needs and challenges, which is a blessing, and also just is really draining for the people doing the work. So thinking about just the mental health support for your staff. And this is true not just in this approach to placement, but many of you know I spend a lot of time thinking about holistic student support. We hear something similar in those reforms, that as we acknowledge that students come to us with more stuff, the people who hear about that stuff need a different kind of support and a different kind of resource. But the other resource for doing this placement redesign work that I thought was really interesting and important was IT and data. And you don't always think about it, but particularly in some of our more innovative approaches, it requires a pretty heavy back-end system. So I'll give an example, and I'm gonna mess it up, and there is someone on this call who knows it better than I do, so my apologies. But essentially, we have a college in our sample. It is the coolest, most wildest thing I've ever seen, where they have braided, because this is a state where adult basic ed is offered through their community and technical college system. They have braided their adult basic education funding with their credit side. So that if you enter through adult basic ed, you have access to credit level courses, but adult basic ed support. If you enter through the credit side, you also have access to support through those adult basic ed instructors who are often those pedagogues that Cree was talking about, right? So it is this wild, they have this rubric. It takes me forever to describe this, but there is a rubric that basically crosswalks the kinds of supports that are being offered through adult basic ed and the credit side, because obviously compliance, right? To build that rubric and get to a place where everyone at the institution can keep track of who's supporting which student in what way under what funding model, they actually had to work with their IT office to rebuild their back-end information system and get to know Salesforce. And so we don't think about the ways that if you're collecting different information about your students as part of the placement process, you actually need a different back-end system to collect that information and use it. What's interesting is that this institution, when we talked to their IT folks, they said, yeah, it was hard, we had to learn things, but it gave them an opportunity to really dig into they were using Salesforce and they were relatively new to Salesforce, to dig into Salesforce and learn about it. And then they could port that knowledge to other initiatives at the institution, right? So thinking about what does a resource mean? Well, now that knowledge, it was resource intensive to gain that knowledge, but it is also now a resource that the college has, right? They really know how to work their Salesforce system. The flip side is we had colleges who were not collecting that information, and they were asking students all of this stuff about their background and their access to food, and they couldn't use it. Like, instructors didn't have access to it to change their pedagogy because they hadn't built those back-end resources. So I do think we need to think really expansively about what resources mean as we move into these iterations and innovations in placement. The final thing I'll say in sort of situating this, Vikash, and I alluded to the pathways and the holistic student support. The other thing we're increasingly seeing is colleges, as this institution with adult basic ed illustrates, trying to blend their dev ed reform with other student populations. So whereas historically, dev ed reform was really for students on the credit side of the house, and if you were coming in with a GED or you were a multilingual learner, you had a different system. Increasingly, we're seeing colleges try to figure out how to create one entry for all students, whether they're coming in through adult basic ed, if they're multilingual, all the same, using things like guided self-placement or an algorithm to make sure that there's a singular open door that then can get students what they need when they need it. And I think that that's a really interesting development, because we also know, like, multilingual learners have often been excluded from the pathways that we're building. And so this is an effort to reconnect those students to our broader institution. Cree, do you have further thoughts now that I've...
What an hour. So I will remind folks these papers will be out shortly, and we'll have all of the detail and the appendices and the nerd fest that some of you want. And some of you can skip that because they're both great at writing executive summaries. So those will be out. Join their newsletters or their, sign up for those. I'll also note the Campaign for College Opportunity has a brief later this summer for looking at more of a more general take on these reforms. I say later this summer because I now have to go rewrite pages 9 through 11 based on what I've learned today. I noted at the top of the hour, we were all going to learn a lot, so I appreciate that. Also, folks, there is a link in the chat for an evaluation form. Please let us know what you thought of today's conversation. And Cree, I will turn it to you for any closeout housekeeping notes and any other messages we need to deliver.
Thank you so much. Yeah, no, I was just going to say thank you all so much. Thank you, Melinda, Vikash. It's been such a wonderful opportunity to connect with you both and share all of this. It's been rich. Really just grateful for everyone who was able to join us today, for the questions. And yes, stay in touch. We will be releasing these reports soon. And thank you so much for joining us.